To different TSI stroke risk warning models Part 1 No. 1702 June 29, 2026 Gerald C. EclaireMD Foundation Category Stroke Preface for readers: eat more protein and fresh vegetables. Eat less red meat and processed food. Reduce food portions if overweight. Eating a little less will not hurt you. Overeating for years will. Exercise every day. Walk at least 7,000 to 8,000 steps daily. Drink 85 to 100 ounces to 0.5 to 3.0 liters of water each day. Sleep 6 to 7 hours every night. Manage stress. Avoid emotionally draining people and unnecessary conflicts. Put your health first. Wealth, fame, and power mean little without health and life. Introduction. One of the fundamental questions in developing any biomedical mathematical model is whether its conclusions remain consistent when different formulations are used to represent the same physiological process. A robust model should not depend excessively on one particular variable or one specific method of calculation. Instead, it should preserve its essential characteristics even when one component is modified. To investigate this question, I compared two versions of my TSI stroke risk warning proxy model. The first model, TSI-3B, uses the daily glucose value measured from my Libra continuous glucose monitoring CGM system. The second model, TSI-3C, replaces the daily glucose measurement with a 90-day moving average glucose value. This long-term average substantially smooths the day-to-day fluctuations caused by meals, exercise, stress, sleep, and other short-term physiological variations. Although these two models use different glucose inputs, they share the highly similar mathematical architecture. Therefore, they provide an excellent opportunity to evaluate whether the TSI framework captures a true physiological signal or merely reflects random fluctuations in glucose measurements. TSI-Stroke 3B equals daily average glucose over 120 times pp 45 times SBP 120 times 120. TSI-Stroke 3C equals 90-day moving average glucose over 120 times pp 45 times SBP 120 times 115. I used two different amplification factors, 120 for TSI-3B and 115 for TSI-3C, in order to bring the average values of both models to approximately the same level for easier comparison. This adjustment allows the comparison to focus on the trajectory shape, timing of peaks, and physiological behavior rather than on small differences in absolute scale. Model comparison produced an interesting and unexpected result, despite using very different glucose inputs. Both models demonstrated nearly identical overall behavior throughout the 2-year observation period from May 30, 2024, through June 29, 2026. Most importantly, both TSI-3B and TSI-3C reached their highest values at approximately June 21, 2025. The day I experienced my hemorrhagic pontine stroke. Following the stroke, both indices declined steadily during the post-stroke recovery period, eventually reaching their minimum values several months later before gradually stabilizing at relatively low levels. This shared trajectory is far more important than the small numerical differences between these two models. The average values differ only slightly. TSI-3C average approximately equals 99.3, TSI-3B average approximately equals 97.0. Such a difference is expected because the two models measure different aspects of glucose physiology. The daily glucose value reflects immediate metabolic status and is influenced by short-term physiological events, whereas TH 90-day moving average, similar to HbA1c, represents long-term metabolic control and serves as a much more stable estimate of chronic glucose exposure. However, despite these differences, both models independently identified the same critical physiological event. This agreement substantially strengthens my confidence that my developed TSI framework captures a genuine interaction among the major physiological risk factors rather than merely reflecting the characteristics of a particular glucose measurement. Physiological interpretation. This observation suggests that the stroke signal detected by the TSI model is remarkably robust, rather than depending on any single glucose measurement. The TSI appears to capture the integrated physiological interaction among three major variables: systolic blood pressure SBP as the acute trigger, pulse pressure PP as a surrogate marker of vascular elasticity, and glucose as the underlying chronic damaging factor. Together, these three variables reflect both the immediate mechanical stress and the long-term metabolic burden acting on the cerebral vasculature. Daily glucose contributes short-term metabolic fluctuations, whereas the 90-day moving average represents long-term metabolic status. Although these glucose inputs differ considerably, both converge on the same high-risk period because the dominant physiological condition surrounding my stroke was the simultaneous elevation of all Th variables. At approximately the same time, my systolic blood pressure increased, pulse pressure widened, and glucose remained persistently elevated. When these three independent physiological components became simultaneously unfavorable, the TSI naturally reached its highest value. Sensitivity analysis and the stabilizing role of pulse pressure PP in the triggering sensitivity index. Overview. During the development of the triggering sensitivity index TSI, a sensitivity analysis was performed to evaluate whether pulse pressure PP should remain an independent variable in the mode. Historical data collected over more than a decade showed that PP remained remarkably stable, typically ranging between 45 mmHg and 52 mmHg, with an average value of approximately 47.5 mmHg. Because of this relatively small variation, it was initially hypothesized that PP might contribute little to the overall model and could therefore be omitted. To test this hypothesis, PP was temporarily removed from the model, leaving the triggering sensitivity index dependent only on glucose and systolic blood pressure. SBP. Results of eliminating P. Contrary to the original expectation, eliminating PP produced substantial changes in the model behavior. The overall trajectory of the triggering sensitivity index changed significantly. The baseline pattern became distorted and no longer reflected the originally observed physiological behavior. The model became overly sensitive to fluctuations in glucose and SBP, reducing its ability to represent the underlying vascular physiology accurately. These findings demonstrated that, despite its relatively narrow range of variation, PP plays an indispensable role in maintaining the physiological integrity of the model. When PP was restored to the model, the original trajectory immediately reappeared and closely matched the observed physiological patterns. From an engineering perspective, PP functions as a damper or a physiological stabilizer, although its numerical fluctuations are relatively small. It provides essential structural information about arterial stiffness and vascular compliance, thereby moderating the interaction between SBP and glucose. This observation illustrates an important principle of biomedical systems. Variables with limited variability should not be considered unimportant simply because they fluctuate within a narrow range. In many physiological systems, tightly regulated variables carry critical information about the structural state of the organism. Their primary contribution is not through large fluctuations but through providing a stable reference that governs the interactions of other physiological variables. Within the triggering sensitivity index, SBP represents the acute triggering force, PP reflects the mechanical condition and inelasticity of the arterial system, and glucose represents the underlying chronic metabolic damage. Together, these three variables interact synergistically to characterize both the immediate mechanical stress and the long-term metabolic burden acting on the inelastic cerebral vasculature. The sensitivity analysis therefore demonstrates that PP is not merely another mathematical input but an essential physiological component required to preserve the stability and biological realism of the triggering sensitivity index of stroke risk warning. This behavior is consistent with the mathematical design philosophy of my TSI model. And like additive risk models that simply sum individual contributions, the TSI uses a multiplicative formulation. Consequently, simultaneous deterioration in multiple physiological systems amplifies overall risk much more rapidly than deterioration in only one variable. The mathematical structure therefore mirrors an important biological principle. Complex diseases often arise from interactions among multiple physiological systems rather than from isolated abnormalities. This is part 1.